Welcome to Afra's Artifacts, where we do some archaeology of our own and dig into the queer side of Star Wars. I'm your host, Alia Morgaine, and it's so great to have you here. Well, today we are joined by two guests because this is my 100th episode. I'm so excited. It started I don't know why this date ended up being the date of my very first Afra's Artifacts, but September 11th, 2020 was the first day that I produced a video, and I am at 100 episodes now with a few shorts sprinkled in. So I'm really excited to have a panel of people to discuss some really fun and sometimes maybe difficult queer issues in Star Wars. So we are joined by JG. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, I'm JG. I am in Pittsburgh. I have, like many of us, have loved Star Wars ever since we were a little kid. I think I have one of my earliest memories is watching in a diaper, and Star Wars has always been there. And as I've grown and as matured, I really have found deeper themes and more practical ways to apply to my life, especially in the fact of being queer and being able to find relations to these characters. And so I think being able to talk about these things are super important.
Absolutely. And then we have Jane.
Hi, super excited to be here. So I am a big High Republic fan. I have my High Republic shelf back there.
Nice.
One of my favorite characters is obviously Ahsoka. As a queer Star Wars fan, Star Wars was like a big part of my life as a kid, and like kind of discovering myself and my identity and like who I was through characters. So yeah, Star Wars has always been a big part of my life, especially the queer side of my life.
That's so awesome. Oh, I'm so glad that both of y'all are here. This is going to be great. Okay, well, let's dive right in with the question of, and I say this is an easy question, but it may not be an easy question because there are a variety of characters to pick from now. But who is your favorite queer character in Star Wars? And whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, I think there's like you said, there's so many we could pick from. I was kind of going through and just like looking back at the books because that's predominantly where they really have been focused and spotlighted on. And I just kept going back to Rey Sloane, and I just love that character, the dominance and the force that how she holds herself, how she presents herself. And when it was introduced in Empire's End in Aftermath, that she had husband and wives in her past, and that they've never died in her hands. Like that just always stuck with me. I'm hoping to this day we still get more of her. I think there's still so much story that's left to be told, and she's just such a strong character that in so many ways for so many people.
And I love how she shows up in different media. Like she's been in, excuse me, at least one short story in Star Wars Insider, which I really enjoyed. She was like a cadet or a really low level, entry level. That was a really good one. So she's a great character for sure. Yeah.
Mine's kind of a simple one because there's not that much known about them, but I do love Sister from Brotherhood and from Queen's Hope. I just think that's such an interesting character and idea of a clone trooper who's trans, because they're identical, they're all the same, they were bred in this way, but the idea of the clones accepting their sister for who she is, and like the idea of like in an identical army finding identity like that. I think that's a super interesting thing, even though we don't know that much about her yet. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm still a little, just because of graduate school plus working full time at the same time, I am a little behind on some of the books. So I am very much looking forward to Brotherhood. I have not gotten a chance to read it, but it's good to know that Sister has a through line. That's really exciting. Clearly you could say Afra, right? Because Afra's Artifacts. And I'm actually wearing my Queer Afra shirt.
Love it.
But I would say that my probably original favorite queer Star Wars character would be Sinjir Roth Velas. I love Sinjir just because he's super funny, but he's been through a lot. And he loves really hard, but doesn't realize that he loves really hard until, the rubber meets the road. And then it's like, wait a second, I really love Condra Kyle. So
Yeah.
I think he is a really fascinating character. That would definitely be besides Afra. I mean, that's a gimme. So what about queer couples?
I can go first here. I know it's kind of, there's maybe some recency bias, but it's also just they're in live action. Vel and Cinta. I really enjoyed that because it also kind of, it felt like a more complex relationship. I feel like sometimes in some of the books early on, it could be like they would have like queer relationships, but it was like one or the other, like in the relationship, was kind of just like a side piece to kind of be there and wasn't really part of the story. So they always just kind of had like normal relationships. And what I really liked about them is their relationship felt complicated. Like one of them is definitely more interested in their relationship than the other, who is like more focused on the rebellion. And I thought that that was a super interesting thing. And it really gave those characters some depth to their relationship. And they were just, I mean, they were not the very first live action, but the very first live action that it was more than a background shot in The Rise of Skywalker.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Blink and you miss a kiss.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I would have to go personally. This is gonna be very a deep pull. I'm gonna go with Kip So and John Laren from The Rising Storm. I absolutely love these two characters. And it's kind of cheating because like they're not fully in a relationship quite yet. But my goodness, I want another story told from their perspective through that book, beyond that book. Throughout that whole like small subplot, you just get this full love story about these two boys that just fall in love at first sight. And I am a helpless romantic. I love coming of age stories, and I just love. It also gave me a little bit. It reminded me of whenever I read Red, White, Royal, Blue. A little bit of taste of that, and just it felt so relatable about that young love and how he tells like, oh, I bet you want to be with that reporter, and he's like, she's not my type, and then instantly they knew. Those two characters for some reason have stuck with me ever since I first read that book.
I love that. Oh, yay. Yeah, I love me some deep cuts. Mine would probably be Sylvester Yarrow and Jordana Sparkburn. I love how they had this puppy love and then it didn't really work out, but then they realized they couldn't be without each other in the end. And I just love how up and down it was. And it wasn't like they saw each other again and, oh, we're back together. It was, wait a second, I don't know about all this because you did this thing and I'm not sure about you anymore. And then it's like, wait a second, I can't live without you. So I really like how that was a really dynamic relationship. It wasn't just, straight all the way, just like one way. It like went up and down and changed a little bit. I like that one a lot. I mean, I like so many of them though. Like I could list numerous ones. For example, Magna Tolvin in Dr. Aphra. I absolutely adore Magna. I think she is wonderful. But yeah, very cool. So, excuse me, I'm so sorry. So let's start at the beginning. Because Jane, you mentioned you were interested in this question. So the first canonical queer character was Moff Delian Mors of Ryloth in the Lords of the Sith novel. And in that novel, she is described as being lazy, hedonistic, has only green Twi'lek servants because they match her plants, I mean, what? Like, you can't get worse
Mhm.
than this.
Yeah.
And she delegates all her duties to those below her who happen to be far more capable and hardworking than she is.
Mhm.
So we have this character who is not a great person, definitely not a role model, and they're the very first canonical queer character.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, thoughts?
I can jump in here. In that, yeah, like I was saying earlier, I had forgotten this character existed. It's been a long time since I
Yeah.
read this book, and so I went back and like reread a couple of the chapters, and I was like, oh yeah, like this is like exactly what Marie said. It's like, oh, this is like a very strange character, and I don't think I would be bothered by it at all if it wasn't that it was like the very first like queer character and stuff. I was like, okay, well, we only went up from there. And obviously, like Star Wars books have gotten significantly better about writing about this stuff. And like certain authors obviously really love to write about this kind of stuff. And this one just kind of felt like, oh, we wrote this really interesting villain and we're gonna make them queer and they're just like the worst person. And then I think like, I don't think anybody was like, oh, like this is our first like queer character. We should like write a better character as our first queer character.
Yeah.
And then like, I think like eventually it was just like, oh crap, yeah, we did do that. Okay, we need to do this like significantly better going forward. And I think they have.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
think it's a pretty good sign that like because for myself also I kind of forgot that it happened. So I mean, in one way, you know, we definitely have got into a better place to the point where like it's almost like, wait, who's that character? But
Mhm.
it does raise an interesting point where that was the very first character, you know, that people were, you know, I really wish I could go back and look at what that reaction was back then and how, what was the conversations. Because I in myself I was still very new getting deep into canon and just
Mhm.
reading that book, and so it it definitely, I think in that time it like is a very bad sign, and it was a very, I could probably see that it could be concerning, but being now that we are in the
Mhm.
present with 2023, it is very promising where we are, you know, where we've had books like Ronin, where we've had the High Republic, and where even what we're seeing in Andor, I think, you know, the future is very bright, and that fortunately that is a pattern that's not repeated.
Mhm.
Exactly. And I completely agree. Like, I want all different types of queer characters, right? I don't
Mhm.
want them all to be wonderful role models. I want them to
Yeah.
be real people. It was just the fact that it was the first one. I was like,
Yeah.
that's a
Mhm.
weird choice.
Mhm. Mhm.
But yeah, y'all are right. Like, it's not a character that I go back to and think about a lot because so much has come since.
Mhm.
Because there has been such an expansion of what is available to enjoy.
Yeah.
So speaking of that sort of thing, that advancement, what do y'all think Star Wars has done well in regards to queer representation?
I think they've done better by just doing more of it and by
Mhm.
starting to show more variety. We're getting so many more different types of representation in the LGBTQ community that, you know, it's very simple just to write it, you know, from like simple perspectives. But the thing about us humans, we're complex. And I think Star Wars is finally starting to dive into that. We're starting to see so many interesting characters, especially in the literature.
Mhm.
Obviously, we would want to see that continue to rise in future visual media, and I do think we're going to start to see that. Um, but I think Star Wars just has done a really good job of just starting to really embrace it and really
Mhm.
realize that, like, yeah, there's not just one type of human out in the world. There's so many different. It's
Mhm.
we're a rich planet full of so many different people.
Right.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. I think just yeah, the ability just of doing more helps a lot, but also I had something I was about to say and my brain went blank. I'm very sorry. But no, I think like it is, what I was going to say is I also think like one of the big things about it is with a franchise this large and with this large of a fan base, I do think it's just like exposing people to new things that they didn't know. Like even me, for example, like when I read Queen's Hope, I had never seen the pronoun, and I hope I'm not mispronouncing it, but it's the ZE and then ZHE as those pronouns. I had never, even I had never like read those before or seen that before. So it gave me something to like look up and be like, oh, okay, so this is what this means and this is what that's supposed to be. And there is something about that kind of exposure and just being willing to do that, especially in literature like that. It can open up new horizons for people who don't always like see that or aren't always around it. So I think that's one of the better things about it.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah. This just popped into my head, but I don't know if y'all remember from the Leia Princess of Alderaan novel, the Chowhuttans. So like the frog people
Oh yeah.
who they had, I believe I'm remembering this correctly, 5 different genders.
Yep.
And their pronouns were based off of their previous gender, their upcoming gender, their current gender, and like a couple other things. So their pronouns were very tailored to them individually. And I thought that was a really cool way to present a non-binary situation. I thought that was really neat. And it was even better because from what I could tell, that was C-3PO's first conversation with Leia. Or like one of his first interactions with Leia was explaining the pronouns of this species. And I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
I love the Chowhuttans. I think they're really fascinating. Okay. So let me see. Okay, we're good. Well, let's talk about let's see. We'll talk about this question. So, what do y'all think about saying certain characters are queer and then not really following through on presenting them as queer? Obvious example, you have Lando Calrissian, because it's like they said, he's pansexual, and then the only instance that I can come up with that is even remotely that he is any sort of queer is, and I don't even like this particular example at all because I find it offensive, is when I think it was the Double or Nothing comic, and he talks about having relations with an it. And I was like, what? That's not okay. Like, I don't know. So do y'all think maybe, in the future there will be some actual evidence that Lando is pansexual? Or do you think they're just going to leave it as, oh, he is, but we're not going to show it?
It's so tricky because I think ever since Disney has acquired Lucasfilm, I feel like it's in almost now, as much as Disney has done a good job of opening so many opportunities for Lucasfilm and Star Wars as a whole, I almost feel like it's kind of put it back in a box in a way, because we've seen what Disney has done in a lot of its own other properties on its own such. And so it's kind of hard to see a future where these, for lack of a better term, legacy characters are, they're not explored true beyond the the literature and the comics and all that. I hope that, as we have seen, now with Andor, and we've seen possibly with even the Acolyte to come, maybe legacy characters we can actually dive deeper into what makes them tick, and more about them and the real authentic them, not just the heroes that we've come to love, but the fact that more people can relate to them, even in their sexuality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think the Lando example is kind of it really does sometimes feel like the example of like a studio just kind of I hate to say it this way, just scoring points of being like, this character is gay, everyone, it's great. We're never going to address it for the wider audience. And really, like, only the people who approve of it are going to ever hear this news. And we're just not going to talk about it any other way. And it's like, that has always kind of annoyed me, especially, I always think, especially with like legacy characters like Lando, who you like see actively like courting people or like in romantic engagements.
Mhm.
I think if you're going to do something like that, I always do think it's a little strange not to, I'm trying to think of how to say this, with some of those characters to just be like, oh, they've always been pansexual and you just didn't know that and they've never expressed that in any way. Where like, I think like sometimes it's an opportunity if it's like, well, maybe just like going like forward, like have Lando explore this like later in life or like something, and like actually have the character like explore and change and like talk to it, like, or like talk about it with characters,
Yeah.
instead of just like, it's actually always been this way and you just didn't know that and we've never talked about it. Like, although, and then I think like the flip side of it is, I think there's a great example in that like Tarkin, I actually kind of like the way they do that, because we never saw Tarkin be romantic in any way whatsoever, like, or like hear about it. So then like that feels a little less cheap when they're like, he's gay and he always has been. It's like, oh, you know what? I can kind of see that. And it's actually like, he was actually romancing somebody in A New Hope. You just didn't know it. It's this like fun little story that we're going to tell. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's more fun and kind of add something instead of just being like, let's not talk about it, but it is happening.
Yeah.
Right. Because, and you're right, because with Lando, he is such a, I mean, a sexual character, a very romantically driven character. And so it's like, if you have this character with those kinds of attributes, you can't just say, oh, he's this, but we're not going to talk about it because, but we see him do those things all the time. So that makes a lot of sense. And Of Intimacy, Sex and Men is one of the best short stories I have ever read. I adore that
So
short
good.
story.
Yeah.
It is so good.
I think another really good example similar to the Tarkin situation was last year's Padawan, where we found out that Obi-Wan was questioning and that he was possibly interested in a guy. And like it took that simple idea about the, you know, that Jedi, should they be romantic or not, but it took it a step further and was able to be like, oh wait, he's actually questioning his sexuality. And I think, you know, as we've seen Obi-Wan and everything that he's done in the prequels and in the show and everything, I think that's another example that like that fits really well in the story like that. And I think it just needs to, like you said for Lando, like we've seen it on screen, the way that you know, he acts and everything, like that should be explored more on screen. But I think something like more intimate like this Obi-Wan story fits really well in that YA novel. I wish more people could experience that, but I think that's another example where it does fit really well in a more intimate setting.
Yeah. Yeah, especially because like, I mean, kind of what you're saying is all Jedi essentially kind of like try to suppress their sexuality of all kind, not like queerness, but just sexuality of all kind.
Right.
So that does work when you explore a character. It's like, yeah, you're opening this up because we know so little about like that character's sexuality in general. So yeah, I think that's a great point.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So I just want to throw this out there. This wasn't exactly, it was like within a question, but and I won't preface this with anything, but if you are familiar with Flix and Orka from Resistance, thoughts?
Man, I am a huge defender of that show. I adore that show for so many reasons. I could probably spend a 4-hour documentary talking about that show, but specifically on that couple. At first, I'm not gonna lie, it was kind of a little, for me personally, I was like kind of what, because I thought it wasn't being taken serious. But then when I took a step back and really just analyzed them more, and just saw that this was being introduced with a target audience of like a very younger audience, I was able to realize that, well, A, first of all, the show's not necessarily made for me, but then B, like the fact that younger audiences are going to get this exposure and it's very clear and they're not hiding it, I think is so important. And I thought that it was portrayed very well with that target audience in mind and with what the parameters of the show was trying to do.
Yeah. I love that. Do you have anything to add, James?
So I don't.
Okay, that's
Resistance is
fine.
one of my blind spots, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say the reason why I didn't preface what I was saying is because I adore Flix and Orka. I think they are so great. Um, I I love how, you know, the people involved in the behind the scenes of the show made it very clear in real life that yes, they are a couple. And then there's so many examples in that show of yes, they are a couple. Like going to visit the other one's mom and then having that weird old married couple thing with the in-laws.
Yes.
And then there was when they went to Flix's family's planet and they were like, "Oh, good find about Orca." And I'm like, wow, they actually like put evidence in the show that they were actually a couple. And yes, they're aliens. They're both aliens. They're not human. But it's number one, it's Star Wars. So I'm okay with that. Number two, you were right. It is a kids show. So, you know, it's just it's weird and wacky and I love it.
It's perfect. It's queer at its finest.
And they're such an old married couple and they're ridiculous and I love them. Okay, so let's see, let me ask this question. So High Republic, so and I may be completely off, what I may not be thinking of this in a way that makes sense, I don't know, but to me it feels like there is more queer representation in High Republic than in general in other locations. And with that in mind, does it feel like it may be just the authors they chose? So this may be just me coming up with conspiracy theories, but it seem like they decided that they could include more queer characters in High Republic because the average off the street Star Wars fan is not going to read it.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I would say I kind of think that there is something to that. I also think, I mean, even more to that point, I think it's they kind of went, none of these characters are ever going to be in live action, probably, like, or like that's not the focus. So like, go for it, because you can kind of do whatever, because they're always going to be in literature, and we don't have to adapt it. So like, that's fine. Which I mean, isn't a great feeling at the same time. But
Yeah.
I do think that's what it is, and I do think it is some of the authors. Like I think it's some of the authors like.
Yeah.
Wanting to, having the full ability to, this is something that they had a lot more creative control over than almost any of the other stories, because all the other stories kind of have to link back to things, and this is just their own thing. So I do think it has a lot to do with creative freedom as well.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. I think there's a lot that goes into that. I think, and I hope, my hope is this, is that as much as I feel they wanted to really tell more inclusive stories, they wanted to really, I think ultimately the goal was to kick off a new era in Star Wars. You know, we really have been stuck in this, you know, we have had the set eras that we've had in canon, and they really wanted to launch a new era. And this will now give, you know, beyond, as we're seeing with the Acolyte, we're going to see now movies and shows have the ability to explore in this. And I do hope that as we're seeing now in Andor, that I hope that it's not true. I hope that we can now include these characters, and we can include the fact that they're queer, and that, you know, we don't even have to make a spectacle of it, but as long as it's inclusive and it's naturally part of the story. Because I think that even in itself could be a problem when you're like, you know, holding up a neon sign like, oh, this character's gay, this character's this. Like, no, like, just let it naturally be part of the story. And I do think the High Republic is very high concentration of that. And I'm hoping that because of the books, that most of these books are on the New York Times bestseller, which means that more than just you know, us, for lack of a better term, hardcore fans are reading all the books. you know, there are people who are on the streets that are just pulling these books off the shelf and they are getting introduced to it. And that whenever, you know, these more stories do get told on the big screen and on our TVs, that the fact that a lot of these characters are queer are not shied upon and that it's just embraced and just part of the story.
Yeah. No, you're right. You're right about the New York Times bestseller list and all that. And so they are being read. I mean, they're fabulous books, so that helps.
Yes.
But yeah, absolutely. So lots of hope in that, right? Lots of hope for the potential future of queer characters in potentially TV, movie type media. Um, so let's see. Let's ask. This is a really big question, I feel like, but and I hope what I'm asking comes across correctly, but what specific issues slash areas of queer life or representation are lacking? So not just like, oh, they don't have, you know, this kind of queer person, but what about a queer person's life, or what specific queer issues might be lacking currently?
Yeah. I think I would like to see more. Like, there's two things when I was thinking about this question and such. I was thinking, one, I kind of want more like just a day-to-day life. You know, I just
Mm,
want to see just the normal, like, you know, just a character's perspective and just, you know, they come home and their partner's there. Like something just as simple as that. And even I would really appreciate more of a perspective of like even coming out in the Star Wars universe and such. I mean, maybe I would hope that in the Star Wars universe that is not even a problem and such, but you know, there are obviously bad characters in Star Wars and such, and so
Mhm.
there could be, you know, maybe people who are part of a, you know, like a religious sect on Jeddah, for example, and maybe it's harder for them to, and they don't feel comfortable, even though there isn't no problem. I there is, I think, a sense of relatability that people can really come to that, and I don't think there's anything wrong with the fact that we have characters who are already established as queer. But I think just to see that journey, that you know, even from like a young perspective or even an older perspective.
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of jump right off that because that's also kind of what I think of is like the coming out or the questioning or like the transitioning. I feel like a lot of, not all, but almost all of like our queer characters in Star Wars are kind of, they know they're queer and they have been for a while, and like there's very little like coming out or questioning or coming to terms with yourself. And what I have always really really wanted to see, and I think would be very interesting and is kind of a missed opportunity, I would really love to see like a trans Jedi who doesn't know that they're trans or like hasn't figured it out yet, because I do feel like body dysphoria or dysmorphia would cause a lot of issues with like connection to the force. It would like not
Mm.
feeling like one with yourself would not make you very attuned to the ways of the force. Like, and I think that would be super interesting. Like, I want to see a Padawan who is like struggling and a master who can't figure out why the Padawan is struggling so much. Like, and I know that's kind of a specific story, but like it's stuff like that that I want to see more of, that I think is interesting, or just yeah, more people kind of questioning and figuring things out as they move throughout their character. And I think the force is an interesting way to tell that story.
That's I had not thought of that at all. That would
Mhm.
be an incredible story.
Yeah.
Uh, do you write?
Yeah, that's a little bit of my fan fiction writing coming out of like,
Love it.
yeah, a little bit of it.
But that sounds exactly like, I mean, I never thought about that before, but like when you're a Jedi, you do have to be one with the Force. And if you're not one with yourself, you can't be one with the Force. So that would be
Yeah.
a really cool story
Mhm.
to read or see. Either one,
Yes.
you
Yeah.
know, pie in the sky
Uh-huh.
dreams.
Yeah.
And I agree too. My number one thing that I think is lacking is that how did you come to be who you are?
Mhm.
Yeah.
What was your journey? And because that's like, I mean, I didn't realize. I went through so many. I was like, I'm this, I'm that, I'm this, I'm that. And finally, when I was like, I don't know, 30, older than 30, I was like, oh, I'm Pan. And it took me forever to figure
Yeah.
that out. And so, like, you don't have to be a young character to go through that journey of trying to figure things out. You can be an older character because in real life, that happens.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, absolutely. I think that's definitely important.
Yeah.
Whew, excuse me. Sorry. So this is and this question, so I guess this is, well, we kind of covered that with that. So this is really the, let me just check, we're doing good. I just want to make sure I don't keep y'all forever. So I guess this will be the last question unless something else comes up, but, and by perfect, I don't mean the perfect character. I mean the perfect character for you in return in terms of relatability. So, what would be your dream example of the perfect representation of a queer character in their life? If you feel like this has already been met, what would that example be? It's a big question.
Very. I think for me personally, like it kind of goes along with what we were talking about earlier, but I kind of want to see like that story of someone who was put under like the religious pressures and such of like for example in Star Wars Force related, let's just say Jeddah. And just to see that journey of them, you know, being under a certain sect of rules and a certain sect of a lifestyle and realizing that you know, maybe through the Force or through what have you, that there's more out to the world and that you know life is not just in a box, like there is no box in life and that you can go anywhere and be anyone you want to be and just I'm looking for that character and I don't think Star Wars has gotten close. We aren't quite there yet, but I do think in the next decade we'll get a character that represents that journey and that I think represents a lot of people, a lot of queer young and old who think that they have come from you know a past life from their parents and even beyond of being just grown up and raised in such an establishment, whether that's religion or something else. I think, you know, there's a lot of relatability there, and Star Wars does not shy away from religion at all. We see that so much in the High Republic itself, especially in the current storytelling. I think that there's ways to be able to include, you know, a queer storyline through that and a queer character that goes through that journey of self-discovery.
Absolutely.
Yeah, to kind of jump, mine's very similar, but yeah, like I said, I would love to see like a trans or a gay character who is like, if you were to do a trilogy, like in the first book is not like does not know who they are or has like experienced it and kind of like going over, so you kind of get to know the character before, during, and after, which I think would always be interesting. But I think the other thing that I think would kind of help with like a perfect idea of representation is, and I know this is a very strange thing to say that I want to see more of, but I do almost want to see like more bigotry to some extent, just so like we know like what it is, because it does seem like the Star Wars universe is a very accepting place, and I do like that because it's a fantasy and you just want to like feel better and it can be an escape in the same way. But I do want to see like, are there people who are like against this, like what is it, because like we get a little bit of it in not Empire's End but the first book in that trilogy, Aftermath, that like he talks about like the Empire wasn't really like anti-gay, but they also didn't want you to ever talk about it, or like this is that. I'm like, okay, that's interesting, just because like that is a part of the universe, and I feel like sometimes we skip over it, which sometimes makes it feel like, oh, it's super easy for these characters and it's not a thing at all, and it's not even like a part of their character. And that's why I want to see like some of that. I just want to see a little bit of that struggle to understand that character better. I don't want to see like blatant bigotry because it's a fantasy and you don't want to like feel terrible, but I also want to like understand who they are through hardship slightly, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely agree with that, because while super acceptingness that seems to be prevalent in the Star Wars universe isn't necessarily what we experience on a day-to-day basis
No.
on planet Earth. So
Yeah.
having a little bit of that, just understanding that Star Wars is a big universe, so there has to be some of that somewhere.
Yeah.
And seeing how those characters deal with those situations, because when you are relating to other characters, it's really nice. You can kind of, I don't know, this sounds weird, I guess, but you can kind of get ideas or kind of gain some perspective over how you yourself could deal with some of those difficult problems, because I know I've learned a ton from different characters that I relate to. So I feel like that could be a very real aspect of queer representation.
And they've
Absolutely.
talked about that a lot, where they especially a lot of the authors have talked about how, like, Star Wars is that place where we can make it where it is like this idealistic reality where there isn't this bigotry and such. But I feel like in a way there can be a respectful way to do it, and to show that there are, just as equally as there's these accepting people, there are these people who maybe aren't as accepted. And you don't have to, like, it doesn't have to be like, brutal or super vile or anything,
Right.
but enough to just get the message clear that there is a journey, there is obstacles, there is, a mountain for sometimes a character might have to go through. And that could be, like you had said, it could be so relatable to a queer person that's reading it, because they could be like, oh, wow, this character went through this, they got over it, I could get through this, I can get over this.
Exactly.
Yep. Definitely.
For sure. So I totally blanked. There was something I was going to say. Um, so now I'm just gonna sit here, and because I don't want to let y'all go, and then I don't remember what it was that I was saying. Ugh.
Yeah, I know this feeling.
Ugh. Oh my goodness. Well,
Tip of the tongue.
yeah, I know. I'm just like, I can't. I know what I was gonna say. Okay, so my perfect representation of a queer character in their life, I relate so much to Amelin Holdo. I think because she's a little wacky. Okay, she's a lot wacky. She is just like ready to try anything, and she's, from what I have read into it, she is pansexual, so I relate to her on that level too. But it would be really perfect if she had some relationships with some different people, because we hear her say in Leia, Princess of Alderaan, like, oh, you're so limiting, Leia. And that, she's much more open to lots of different relationship opportunities. And I want to see those relationship opportunities, not just what's in her head, but carrying it out too. But I think she's wonderful, and so I just want more of her. So
Yeah, that's a character that I want so much more of. Like, I feel like we barely see her anymore, and I'm just like, no, she's great. More, please.
She is so good. I love the way she dresses all crazy, and she just acts crazy, and I'm like, I can be that sometimes. So that is me. So if there is anything else either of you would like to add just on the topic of queer Star Wars representation.
I think the only thing I'll add is that, like, as much as I kind of said this before we started hitting recording, but I think it'd be so easily to point out the flaws and the areas that Star Wars has lacked in. I think it's always so much better to hold on to the hope, hold on to the future. I mean, that's what Star Wars is all about. That at least from what we can tell, it's getting better, and that as more stories come out, as more TV shows and movies, more creators get involved, we're going to see more inclusion. That way, anyone and everyone can watch Star Wars and see themselves, and they could come away from it taking away lessons that so many people have for the past 40 years.
Absolutely. Very cool. do you have anything to add or?
I don't.
Good.
I don't. Yeah, I just
Okay.
really enjoyed this conversation. Yeah.
Yay!
Same.
Okay, so if you would like to let people know where they can find you, you may share.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter, JG_Cars, and that's where I mostly post all about Star Wars, High Republic, all that good stuff.
Nice.
You can find me at Lilo and Jane on Twitter, and yeah, that's just about it. Yeah. Yeah,
Awesome.
just posting all my book love and stuff. Yeah.
That's always the best. Well, thank y'all so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. This has been a fabulous conversation. I've really enjoyed having y'all on. And for those watching, be sure to comment down below if you want to add to the conversation. I'd love to hear what you have to say. And remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me on Twitter at Alia Morgain, and peruse my blog at thestarsreview.blogspot.com. May the Force be with you.